have put together here a really fantastic dynamic panel that I am privileged to share the stage with and hopefully get some questions from you. I'm going to briefly introduce each of them as they come up. Our first guest is responsible for global logistics and containers at GM, working from the early design phase of vehicles and programs right through to purchasing transport and equipment. He's been with the company going on 37, 38 years, and many roles across the supply chain. It's my pleasure to welcome on stage Edgard Pezzo from General Motors. Thank you so much, Edgar. Thank you, Edgar. Yeah, please have a seat. And for those of you who haven't had a chance, please, on the Automotive Logistics homepage, you'll see an interview with Edgard and Automotive Logistics queuing up a lot of the things we're going to be talking about, so I hope you'll check that out. Our second guest has global responsibility for procurement and supply chain across this major tier supplier. She has more than 25 years experience in procurement, was with other suppliers, including Adient, and is now the Chief Supply Chain Officer at IAC Group. My pleasure to welcome Kelly Bysouth. Thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you. And to hear as well from some of our providers as well. So the next guest joined DSV following work as an engineer and other roles at companies including Honda, Tesla, electric vehicle last mile, and has more recently as well was at Mahindra North America. Recently joined DSV and is leading up the electric vehicle mobility and competence center. It's my pleasure to welcome Eva Ames. Eva, so nice. Why don't you join us down this way? And last but not least, of course, with more than 25 years experience across OEMs, Tier 1s, and representing CEVALogistics, it's also my pleasure to welcome James C. Williams, VP of Global Key Accounts at CEVA. Thank you so much, James. Why don't you please join us? So there we have a panel, I think, well representing the supply chain as we face it and see it today. In North America and indeed beyond. And so we've got some questions we want to go through in a panel format. Hope to hear from some of you as well. But let me start by kicking it off for each to reflect. The crises that we've seen, as I mentioned, have thrown up many vulnerabilities that will require some long-term changes, of course. But as I mentioned right at the start, it is forced flexibility and resiliency to keep the flow, to keep plants running. I'd like to get a sense from each of you where you've notably increased resilience in your logistics operations, and let's kick off from there. Edgar, I'm going to start with you.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me today. So I think that some areas that we have seen a lot of improvement in terms of resilience, and I would say that maybe three of them. One was since the start of the pandemic, I think that we have learned a lot in terms of how to work internally, cross-functionally, between logistics, manufacturing, finance, and all the other areas. I think that has really improved and increased a lot of our resilience internally. And I think the second one is that how we really start working and enhancing our partnership with our logistics providers. And that is one thing that I think that improved a lot our resilience as well. And the third one is we're going to talk more about that, but is the end-to-end visibility. That's one thing that we started invested in last year, and we are going to continue investing on that. I think these three areas most probably are the ones that have increased a lot our resilience.
Thank you, Edgar. Kelly?
Hi, I'm sorry to, I'll echo.
Yeah. We will move the order around so there's not always echoing.
I'll echo a lot of what Edgard said. Absolutely breaking down the silos amongst the different functions, whether it be manufacturing, procurement, supply chain, logistics, to make seamless and quick decisions was absolutely critical. I will also say that having very strategic relationships with key logistics partners was also very critical. And there's not one size fits all, as everybody knows, so you have to have your normal, logistics providers, but then you also have to have relationships with premium providers and ocean providers, et cetera, to be able to make the quickest and most efficient and effective choices when you're in a critical position. One other thing that I think was absolutely key for us at IAC that we worked on a lot during the last 2 years was to better use the data that we have at our disposal to make good decisions. So really taking the mass amounts of data that we all deal with on a daily basis and really manipulating that data and serving it up in a way that helps us to make decisions more efficiently and effectively, and you know, kind of analyze trade-offs, potentially give that data to our strategic partners, whether it be our suppliers or our logistics providers, to help us, you know, move things to where they need to be as effectively as possible. So those are the things I would point to.
Thanks, Kelly. And turning from a logistics service provider, so I'm going to start with you first, Ava.
Sure, I think resiliency is both supporting the crisis of the day and also taking that data that we're able to collect, the end-to-end visibility, and figuring out what to do about it, reevaluating what the goals are so that we're not just able to keep the supply chains flowing, keep that line going today. How do we actually evaluate what's happening from a historic perspective and figure out how to apply that to the future? Are the goals for supply chain different now because the products that we're making are different and because the priorities are different? And being able to have partnership beyond just having someone to call because there's a crisis and you need someone to help you solve that today, but also inspire some change for the future and provide a view of resiliency that goes beyond just being able to react, being able to predict and strategically develop what you want to do in the future, which might be very different than your goals from the past.
Very important points. James.
So first, we had to change our mindset. We had to realize that disruptions are coming more frequently and they come in sooner. So in the past, where we were looking to be lean and just focus on waste, now we had to change the goals to start to think about agility and flexibility and not so much look at the product in the individual vacuum, but study the supply chain in its entirety and understand where the trade-offs will come. And so once you've done that, then applying the proper tools that create visibility that will allow you to gain the ability to make decisions quicker from dynamic mode changes, inventory stocking policies, trade-offs in transportation, and inventory stocking policies then started to become more important. So truly understanding the supply chain and responding to it versus individual products became more important inside our organization.
So there we see where the focus has been on flexibility, on mindset, as Ava mentioned, also looking ahead based on the data that we can collect. I just want to finish off our intro round, if you like, with some reflections on what still needs the most improvement on terms of resiliency if we look at the supply chain today. Obviously, you can't control the external factors that are continue to disrupt many things. But in terms of your organizations and what you can do, Kelly, I want to start with you on that side. Where do you still see the most need for improvement?
In particular at IAC, we're still continuing to work on using our data and getting our data to help us make the right decision. So we're constantly working on that, and whether that means refining the data that we're getting out of our base systems. We're doing a lot of work to try to standardize our base systems where we can, because it always makes things easier. But then on top of that, layering on tools to effectively pull that data up and make decisions and get it where it needs to be, like I mentioned, to either our suppliers, our logistics providers, et cetera, so we can make those trade-offs. I think that's honestly one of the biggest tools that we have, certainly as a tier one and probably even at the OEM level as well, is data and getting that data to do the work for us versus spending all of our time kind of data mining. So that would be one of the things that we're still working on, and I think is absolutely critical.
Edgard, anything from GM?
Yeah, now I'm going to echo you. We didn't talk about that before, but I think that I said end-to-end visibility, but data analytics is one that we have started working already internally here. We work with our company, 8 things. We have invested a lot, both of us. I think that's a great opportunity for us to continue working on that, raise the bar in terms of how can we use the data to better predict and forecast and work together with our partners to tell you the truth. How can we better redesign, predict, and make changes if we need? So I think that's the area that. Not that we are not there yet, but I think that we need to continue working on that.
Absolutely. James.
I think we're all going to be echoing each other's point, right?
We shouldn't have got such a cavernous review.
The access to the data and the quality of data as soon as possible is critical. So having comprehensive visibility tools that allow you to collect that data across all the modes of transportation then allows that strategic war room to crunch that data to then start to make dynamic mode changes required to meet the needs of the plants. So the things that Things is doing, working with guys like Freight Verify, is starting to get us there. But if there's areas of improvement as those technologies improve in terms of their comprehensiveness, their robustness, and their reach across all modes of transportation, will start to allow us to get to this point to make dynamic mode changes.
We're going to pick up on some of those, I believe. Ava, anything you want to add or echo?
I'm going to take a slightly different approach to this. I'm an engineer. I love data. We all love data, right? I think that knowing what your data says is really important, and I think it's even more important to understand what your data does not say. We spend a lot of time refining visibility tools, collecting data, better data, data. At the same time, logistics has always been a people industry. It will always be a people industry. And having people that understand how to drive these increases in technology, better visibility, data processing, having the people who have the intelligence to make these decisions and a corporate culture that supports that. We need to retain this talent. We need to grow it. We need to encourage this. And we need to not just rely on these visibility tools. Not so long ago, computers came around and they completely changed everything. And we're having this huge renaissance where we're looking at products differently, which means we're changing supply chain needs. And when we dig that deep down into it, the tools that we all think are super revolutionary today, because they are, in 20, 30 years from now, we're going to be looking back and we're going to have the same conversation about how we wish that we'd done things differently. At the end of the day, it's people that make these decisions. And it's great to look at tools, but we need to keep looking at what the data does and does not say, because especially with all the disruption, tools are only as good as the inputs that they're given.
Correct.
I would have thought I maybe planned it, but most of the things you have mentioned are things we will drill down into other parts of this conference as well. So talent is an important one, and we have, for example, this event have students from Wayne State and Michigan State, and we have a session tomorrow focused on some exactly of those skills and talent development, and we'll pick that up more across. So thank you for bringing that up. Thanks for everyone for those inputs. One of the things James talked about was the dynamics, the dynamic changes and mode changes, and we've seen across the supply chain the need to shift and change more frequently. Production schedules changing based on availability. And I know, Edgard, we've spoken about this as something GM has certainly had to react to as well. Can you talk a little bit about how that has already changed some of the ways that you work with your providers and partners to do that?
Yeah, I think that we have learned a lot, and again, enhancing our partnership with our providers, we have learned a lot how to, be more flexible and be more, dynamic in terms of how we would be managing the let's say, surprises and crises that we have had so far. And I think that's one thing that was really a strength, is that in that partnership, we were able to work together in order to, face the crisis and get together and change the modes if we needed. For example, in ocean, we changed many times because of the crisis that we were having. For example, in China, also we worked together in changing modes from one port to the other. So I think that's one thing that we have learned a lot together in terms of how can we adapt, how can we protect not only the network but also protect the plants in avoiding disrupting our production. I think that was one biggest learn we had.
And James, I'm going to put that one back to you as well in terms of, from, say, CEVA's point of view, working with customers like GM and I'm sure many others. Internally, how did that change how you organized around it and also interfacing with those customers?
Right. So I think Eva opened the door when she talked about the talent. So what we learned in this process is, from a talent identification, that we needed to bring more people who understood supply chain and know how to bring solutions to the table. Historically, we was more concerned with guys that can key data into the system, open up files, bill, book the shipments. But in those war rooms, you need to have not that type of person. You need to have somebody who know how to make solutions, right? I can remember being in war rooms and I have Sahib saying, okay guys, we need you to be more proactive in your solution development. Yes, you do a great job of responding to when we say things, but in this scenario, we are looking for partners that are coming forth with more innovative solutions, not just responding. So what that did is that had to change how we organized ourselves to make sure that we're now bringing in individuals with that type of mindset, making sure you're placing them within the critical accounts that are requiring that type of need so that you're meeting the needs of your client.
Eva, do you want to add on to that anything?
Critical thinking is everything.
Yeah.
We need to be able to use the data as a tool. We shouldn't be letting the data make decisions for us and following it blindly. And being able to recognize when something's not right, being able to bring that up. It's more than just proactive communication, it's proactive recognition.
And Kelly, I mean, from your point of view, and also perhaps considering as a tier one, you probably have other types of constraints, and be it from what's coming from the OEM side versus what you're inbound. So how has that changed the way you need to work across your supply chain?
Well, I mean, you know, obviously in the last 2 years we've been challenged. Our OEM customers have challenges, and those challenges flow into the tier ones, and we have to react for sure. You know, I would say what we've struggled with over the last couple of years is trying to obviously keep the wheels on, deal with the crisis of the day, but also keep moving forward to become more proactive. And that's what I've really tried to focus on in my role with my team is, yes, the crisis of the day is always going to be there, and honestly, there's always been a crisis of the day. It just, unfortunately, the last 2 years, they've all come at the same time, and they just don't stop. But there's always been these, I laugh when you talk about these war rooms. Yes, I've sat in the war rooms before when there's been a hurricane or a typhoon or a earthquake or what have you in some certain part of the world, and the only way to really figure out what your situation is start mapping things on boards and massive spreadsheets, and by the time you even get it updated, it's already old. Fortunately, we're moving away from that. We still have to kind of get into that war room mentality sometimes, but we're not spending all of our time as spreadsheet jockeys, most of us. So it's good. We're moving in the right direction, and I would echo what was said regarding talent. We have to have talent that are decision makers versus data miners. So, and that is, it's exciting to see because supply chain is really moving into a function that is a critical business function versus just chasing parts, chasing trucks, you know, and so it's actually really exciting to see at the moment.
Absolutely. So definitely 3 cheers to the move towards data mining. I hope in 20 years that it's still not spreadsheets. I definitely can't guarantee that. That seems to have been something that we talked about 20 years ago as well. Edgard, in the interview that we just did and published in Automotive Logistics, one of the things we talked about, which GM did, perhaps somewhat unique to GM, or at least unique to what you'd previously have done, was to secure extra capacity as an insurance policy. For key modes, ocean and rail, ocean and air, for example. Could you just tell our audience here a little bit more about how you worked with partners to identify and secure this insurance?
Yeah, I think that that started with the pandemic, and we realized that most probably we're going to have a lot of difficulties when the plants were going to go back to work again, that we were going to have a lot of difficulties, most probably, to get capacity in the market, being ocean, being air. So then we start working internally, cross-functionally, to better understand the data that we had in terms of when the plants were going to come back again producing, and what was going to be the gap in terms of volume that we need to move in order for us to keep the plants running. I think that was the first step, working together internally. Then we start identifying partners for us to get together, and I start identifying capacity ahead, that we could buy ahead in terms of what we called insurance policy. And we did that. We did that in 20, we did that in 21, and we did that both sides. We did that in the ocean, and we did that in the air. So then I think one question is that did we use all of them? No, we didn't use all of them, but there was like insurance, right? We have insurance for our houses, and we hope that the house does not get on fire. But we use a lot of all those also insurance policy, extra capacity, because because of the lots of surprises we had. Sometimes we needed to change the scheduling of our plants, and that extra capacity really helped us to mitigate or even avoid disruptions. I think that's one thing that we put in place. That, of course, increased our cost, but I think that's worthwhile because we were able to keep the plants running and some of the plants running as well.
Yeah. Eva, is that an approach that you've seen or worked with other customers on as well?
Absolutely. Recognition of risk and factoring that into supply chain design is critical. We've all recognized risk, and supply chain has been essentially 50 shades of gray in automotive, right? We're all doing essentially the same thing. And now that everybody has different goals in mind for their strategy for electrification, whether it's transition from internal combustion to electrification, or whether it's a new EV-only company, and not just for the OEMs, for all the suppliers as well. Everybody has a different goal. Everyone has a different tolerance for risk. And the ability to centralize supply chain and recognize that maybe there's an increased cost in that security policy, but at the end of the day, it keeps the supply chain going and allows cars to continue to be sold. That is something that's definitely been elevated through the pandemic with the disruptions every day. We live in a war room now, right? and being able to factor that in and being able to help our customers think a little bit more holistically about their supply chain beyond just Trans-Pacific eastbound ocean and just air. Thinking beyond a single plant, thinking about the whole supply chain, and really rethinking the conventional. Sorry, our CFO says we can only have 1 week of inventory in the warehouse. Well, does that still apply today? Let's talk about it.
And James, from CEVA, in working with these sorts of approaches, did it also change the way you had to work with carriers and contractors to secure that, expanding fleets, et cetera, to have that insurance ready for your customers?
So the answer is yes. One of the key enablers to allow us to be successful during this pandemic time was that decision, right? But because now we know we have a defined commitment in the form of an insurance policy, we then had to take on more control. Before, in a freight forwarding perspective, you would just go to the open market, buy capacity, and hope that it's there. And in this scenario, it was coming, it was going. But once the commitment was made that insurance policy is a key strategy, we were able to secure, pull down assets of our own, which typically we would not have done, right? Which then gave us more control to ensure that we were successful in protecting the health of our client's supply chain.
Kelly, I think it's probably clear to many other tier ones and twos and maybe even OEMs that approach of buying extra capacity that you won't need isn't necessarily possible for everyone, and or at least hasn't been. So, how do you see that from your perspective as a tier one? And if you can't buy the extra insurance, what else can you do to work to get the priority and capacity that you need?
Yeah. So yeah, certainly. In my experience, the tier ones I've worked with would never be able to do that. So I think two things. One, as I mentioned in the beginning, having good strategic relationships with your logistics providers was the first and most important. We absolutely relied on them to make sure that when we needed to move things, they had the capacity to do it. Now, was it 100% flawless? No, but I also would say I'm pretty happy about how we minimized the impact to our ultimate customers during the past 2+ years. So that was probably the most important lever that we had pulled. And then, secondly, what we really focused on during the height of the pandemic when the automotive, world was basically shut down, we really worked strategically with our key suppliers that were supplying to us to ensure we understood they had the capability to start back up. And that was really, talking to them about their cash flow, making sure they were ready with labor and, et cetera. So I think those are the two things that we really focused on versus going and, actually purchasing, extra capacity from a logistics perspective.
So Ava just mentioned we live in a war room now. Unfortunately, that probably applies to more of the world than we can talk about in an automotive logistics event. But that clearly it's still important, this tactical forensic approach to tracking materials and capacity. And Edgar, I think we've been alluding to this through data and data mining and things that we can do. But at GM, for example, has there been moves towards, say, maybe automating some aspects of this and control tower type scenarios, et cetera, so that it's not what Kelly was saying earlier, this move from, say, spreadsheet chasing to a more strategic, automated way to make some of those decisions?
Yes, that's one thing that we have been working a lot, and I mentioned that one area that we need to keep on improving is exactly this, the data analytics. We have invested a lot lately and working with A-Things, the company that I mentioned before. I think that we join forces with them, and with that data analytics that we have been being able to gather data, identify and forecast our shipments as well as predict some of the crises. I think that's the way that we are investing in that space, Chris.
And when we look at the visibility itself, and I think you talked about that as a big focus right from the beginning, is there technological solutions that you've turned more to in that as well?
I think that's another area that we are also investing a lot, which is the visibility where our cars are, vehicles are, where our parts are, and that's probably one area that we have been really truly going forward more and more, which is working with Freight Verify, in fact. And that Freight Verify gives us visibility of all inbound material as well as where our vehicles are. And that works together with it's a GPS point, and also we work together with our own tool, the OnStar. So all that can really, for vehicles, we can identify where the vehicles are as well as where the parts are. I think this is another tool that's helping us a lot. And of course, we are still implementing that. We are still in phase of fully implement that. But I think I would say that today we have a lot more visibility of where our parts and vehicles are.
And again, looking from the logistics provider side, James, has there been a new suite of tools you've also looked to, or integrating various tools into systems that you're using to improve that visibility?
So the tools are the same that Edgar had talked about, but you had mentioned control tower in the question. For us, that has been a key point, because what it's done is it allowed us to sit in the planning process. And as you're sitting in the planning process and you're understanding what needs to be where, right, you can then maneuver our assets accordingly to make sure that we understand, and then connecting with those visibility partners, then the community is meeting the needs of a GM.
Eva, anything you'd add?
I would say the new tools are available every day, and the biggest challenge is in connecting these new tools to the legacy systems that really keep these giant legacy companies going. There's a huge risk to changing the data systems that emerged previously that are so core to every single aspect of company life, and changing the data inputs to allow these new tools to integrate with the existing data is a huge risk. And it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough to find a way for all these tools to coexist. At some point, is Automotive going to have to get away from EDI? Maybe. Yeah, okay. We'll try again next year.
We said, let's not touch that subject.
Kelly, I'm not going to make you comment on EDI, but in terms of IAC, are you working through a TMS? Are you working through providers' TMS? Is it about integrating that with your legacy systems, all of the above?
Yeah, so we do not have our own TMS. We work through our providers' TMS in our individual regions. I've also been part of trying to manage our own TMS in former companies. I firmly believe that the tier one suppliers, their core competency is not logistics. It shouldn't be. It should be making parts. So, I'm a firm believer that the tier ones in most cases, and the ones I've been in very big ones, and even IEC is smaller. It's not our core competency. So that's how we choose to manage. But as I said, and I think what we are focused on is making sure that we're providing the data into our logistics providers' TMS to allow that seamless transition, so they can dynamically load and assess opportunities for cost savings, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how we choose to go about it.
Absolutely. One thing you'll learn about me over the next 2 days is I will always have more questions, but and the panel knows that as well. But are there any questions from the audience right now? And we have one right in the front, so I have a microphone heading your way. Ingo's coming here right in the front. If I can just, when you have the microphone, if you just say your name and company and then ask your question. Thank you.
Do you want me to stand?
You can stand up and show us.
Hi, Mike Paniccia for Risha Interior Systems. I had a question for Kelly, being in the Tier 1 automotive field. I know that we can have some pretty tough days out there, and I kind of just wanted to see from a managerial standpoint and having that bird's eye view, how you go about not only talking and managing your suppliers, but as far as going to talking to the OEMs as well, because you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place sometimes. So in a position that you're in, how do you go about this procurement and risk prevention problems and go about fixing the issues and, in a given day with transportation and making parts?
Well, I don't know if I can answer that because you're a competitor.
Spirit of openness.
So you're right. I mean, I don't know if you're in supply chain or procurement or where your role is.
Supply chain mostly.
Supply chain. So I mean, as I kind of, I guess, joked a little bit, we kind of, our customer, when our customers have challenges, we have challenges. So how do we, I think for me, it starts with having as good of dialogue as possible with your customers. I mean, if your customers are causing pain, it may not be because they're intentionally trying to cause pain. I think usually it's not. They just have problems themselves. So I think the more you can talk and have open dialogues, and I think really honestly it starts with the plant-to-plant relationships. I think a lot gets done when you have strong open dialogue plant-to-plant. So my plant versus our customer plant and those teams talking. Those guys know a lot more of what's going on than I ever do. And and again, you can see when those relationships are strong that there's more of a seamless, cooperative relationship. And when there's a problem that is being caused at, say, my plant, when we call up our GM plant and try to work through it, those guys can usually get things done. So I would say, try to keep it as local as possible. And when things get up to a managerial level, it sometimes gets, non-productive. But yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I'm in logistics, but I think the three of us will work very well together.
Yeah, there's another question right here, right in the middle. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks. John Brennan with Bloom Global. Eva, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, as we just started working with DSV. Where would you go with the EDI? I know you opened that door a little bit, but could you give us a little window of what you're thinking?
Sure. There's never been a bigger demand for data, not only here with all of us who have always wanted it, but even with the C-suite. With the pandemic, everyone got used to e-commerce, and that instant, I ordered it on Amazon, it showed up at my door, they texted me. If I can order a pizza down the street and see when it's being made, why can't you tell me where my container is? With EDI, we're limited with the kinds of inputs. So even if you had your own TMS, you're limited to the quality of the data that's able to feed into it. With every country having a different communication standard or not having one at all, with every steamship line and every carrier reporting data and milestones in a different way, it's really, really hard to file that all down into a file of something useful that comes through EDI. I think that there are a lot of other tools. API is a great example of a launching point where we're able to get better quality data in and out for a more meaningful communication.
Thank you, Eva. One other point I wanted to pick up on, and it's been raised, we'll come back to that question just in one moment, is on, and I think it was James or perhaps Eva who alluded to challenging the CFOs on certain, assumptions around levels of inventory. So the trade-offs that we've had to make in some cases, and how you evaluate those trade-offs versus inventory, putting a warehouse in a location. Edgard, can you talk about how that's looked at GM in terms of balancing that, who you've had to work more closely with, perhaps even internally, to make those kinds of decisions?
I think that that's not the only tool. I agree with you, Eva. But I think that's one thing that we have learned throughout because up to just before the pandemic, right? Everything was lean. Let's go lean. So the minimum inventory we would have, the better for us. So then with the pandemic, we start learning that that was not going to guarantee us that we were going to have a healthy network that would guarantee the flow of components to our plants. So together with the insurance policy that I mentioned, so then we start working together with our finance team to start analyzing, should we instead go into a different path and start increasing some of our inventories, not across the board, but looking for the most critical parts that we can identify and then starting increasing inventories. And that's one thing that we have done so far. So we have placed some of the areas that we need to increase the inventories to work together with the policy insurance that I mentioned. So that is being a very successful initiative. Of course, the question is, are we going to continue doing that in the future? I think that's one thing that will be very dynamic, to tell you the truth, but I think that for the time being, I think that's one thing that we have been very successful on that. But again, working together with the finance team, with manufacturing, to make sure that we have, because we needed to find more space. In some cases, we need to develop some warehouses, but I think that's one way that helped us to really truly making sure that we mitigate or even disrupt the flow of material into our plants. But I understand Eva is not the only tool. That was one tool that we use as well.
And I would say that one of the challenges that a lot of our customers faced during the pandemic was the supplier would make the parts, they'd load it in an ocean container, so you get that EDI message, right? Something has been shipped, but you don't really know what. You can't really verify that. You just know that a shipment's been made. Container's stuck. Well, the line's going to go down. So now we're asking the supplier to make parts again. We're going to fly it, but you ordered that inventory, and even though you don't have it, you own it. Now inventory is not just what's sitting in the warehouse, because we don't have a regular cadence of inbound, outbound, and all of a sudden we own inventory everywhere, so we have a huge risk and a huge financial cost of owning this inventory even though it's not really in our possession yet. And in the future, I hope that we can move to a better IT infrastructure where we're able to look, and sometimes I live a little bit too far in the future, but I don't actually think this is that far away, where we know exactly what's in each box, on each pallet, in each truck, because autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles and IoT connections are right around the corner, and once we know exactly where things are, we can integrate that directly on the line, and this is where AI and predictive analytics can really take this to the next level, but not on an EDI message.
But one thing I've also have spoken about from hearing and the others, of course, the predictive analytics will be important, but you do need the specificity of it too, right? So saying in general, we suspect this will arrive at this point is, also causes its own challenges. So you need a real milestone predictive ability as well.
Is the milestone real?
Yeah, exactly.
And if we're all reporting the same milestone differently, it kind of loses its meaning.
Yeah.
So Eva and I, we have been talking about going from E to A. EPA to A.
I think we have another question in the back there. If you say your name and company.
Yeah, no, great panel discussion. I'm Salim Sheikh with Blue Yonder. And I think we had a really good dialogue on enabling or strategies to enable supply chain resiliency, right? Better end-to-end visibility, carrying additional inventory or capacity as a hedge to enable resiliency. Was just curious now with inflation at a 40-year high, right? And next year, 2 years are going to be key. So just wanted to hear from the panel on any strategies you're undertaking to counter inflation, right, over the next couple of years, whether it's working capital reduction or any other initiatives you have in mind?
Maybe start with you, Kelly.
Yeah, so obviously working capital, I would say we're pulling all of the same levers that we always pull, but probably with more urgency, maybe I'll say. So obviously our inventory, unfortunately we're kind of stuck in a place where we're having to increase levels of inventory because of longer transit times and those issues that we have. So that's kind of going against the whole, trying to save money topic. So, again, I don't think we're doing anything that is out of the ordinary. We just have a higher level of sense of urgency because our costs are increasing as everyone else's are, and we're kind of getting squeezed. So, we're looking to fill our own plants as much as possible, where we may have been a little more picky in the past. All of these things you really kind of do in a crunch time we're doing.
And I think the same for us. As I mentioned, I think that's going to be a very dynamic kind of an analysis. We just started increasing our inventories beginning maybe the end of last year. I think that with now the inflation that you just mentioned, I think that will be very dynamic for us to rebalance that more frequently. But I think that also we need to take into consideration that if we don't do that very well, then we end up flying parts, which is going to most probably cost us much more. So I think those three pieces will be always in front of us and will be very dynamic.
Absolutely. James, from a logistics provider point of view, are you being pulled more into advanced planning aspects from your customers? So, here we're talking about the quick reactions, and I know from speaking with Edgar that looking out to the future is really important to optimize the supply chain. As a logistics provider, are you also feeding more into those aspects of supply chain design and decision making?
So the answer is yes. And as I talked about it earlier, those are the things that have allowed for us to help our clients maintain resiliency. The quicker that we're in the planning process, the more we can make adjustments to our assets to ensure that they have exactly what they need. Now, is that a general practice? The answer would be no, right? That would be more with your strategic clients that you have the long-term relationships with, because we are an asset-light provider, so therefore we have to be very specific in when we deploy these things. But the answer is yes.
Okay, yeah.
I would say that all of our customers are asking us for strategic advice right now. And honestly, some of the larger customers have a hard time making the bigger changes. A lot of our smaller customers are extremely dynamic, and they'll do things like looking at where the free trade agreements exist, and they don't have a huge spend. They're not going to be able to go out there and reserve capacity. These are guys that are doing 1 or 2 TEUs a week. We had a smaller customer come to us recently and ask about whether it was a good idea to shift their production from Mexico to Colombia. And when we looked at the rates for their volumes, the rates were insane. It's the coffee industry, right? How's a little guy going to compete with the coffee industry? So maybe additional benefits for a free trade agreement on duty, but at the end of the day, point A to point B, it really was not a good decision. I think customers are really interested in figuring out what their risk is, looking at other opportunities, and nearshoring doesn't happen in a day. We're all pushing for more and more nearshoring, but this is not something that's going to happen overnight. And taking a bigger picture look at all the different pieces that go into supply chain, from production all the way down to country of origin calculations for the end vehicle, I think all of our customers are trying their best to be strategic, and I think that there's been a greater need through the pandemic for customers to rely on those of us who are in the war room every day, living with the actual demands of the logistics industry.
Kelly, I think in your role as Chief Supply Chain Officer, that must be, I would imagine, part of your strategic objective is to be able to weigh in and then influence the longer term decisions. How are you balancing those with, well, the fact that it's hard to tell what's a long-term trend right now with some prices? I mean, how are you working with your suppliers, partners to assess that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're doing, and I kind of echo what I said before, we're doing what we always have done. I think when we make sourcing decisions, always we try to look at it from a total cost of ownership perspective. What's changing now is really what you thought were pretty stable costs to move apart from one region of the world to the other is now not so stable. It's not so stable from a cost perspective, and it's not so stable from a transit time perspective. So those are the things that we have to look at more closely, but the pieces of that puzzle are still the same. We just have to make sure we have the scrutiny on and understand what the latest data points tell us. We are, and I will echo what was also said about nearshoring. I mean, everyone wants to talk about it. It's one of those buzzwords that everyone's like, oh yeah, just nearshore it. Well, no, yeah, that doesn't really happen that easily, especially in the automotive space when everything is, pretty much everything we buy is tooled. So the things that aren't tooled are raw materials, and again, those things aren't readily available everywhere, as we know when we talk about batteries, right? So nearshoring is fine. Oftentimes, when you get to a point where you can pull the trigger on a nearshore opportunity, the dynamics have again changed because it takes so long to retool, et cetera, recertify, test. I mean, there's lots of things that have to happen in the automotive space, as you guys all know, to move things from one part of the world to another. So we're looking at all of those things, but I would say oftentimes on current production parts, those things are not viable.
So let alone in an extremely strong dollar scenario as well. I think if you really want to get cheap stuff, come to the UK. Your dollar's going far, I promise you.
In Europe, yeah.
Just a last point on that, Edgar, because I know total enterprise costs always a big focus for General Motors. But clearly, again, as we've been alluding to, this sort of risk factor, these other factors that logistics now bring to the table. How are you, in working with your purchasing counterparts and team members, trying to assess that?
Yeah, I think that one thing that we have been doing a lot is working together with our cross-functionally, mainly with purchasing. I think that, for example, in terms of how we work for future programs, as well as with purchasing for current programs, in terms of how we can identify together risks, as well as how we can rebalance and even near shore, for example, the supplier footprint. I think that's one area that we have been investing a lot in terms of how can we work together, how can we put the total land cost together, how can we make sure that we optimize the total supply chain.
Great. I think we have time for maybe another. We'll start right here in the front.
Yeah, hi, thanks.
I think you're on. I think it'll.
I am?
Yep, there you are.
Derek McKenney with Kuna & Nagel, head of Customs and Trade Development for North America. I just had a quick question. It's great that Customs and Trade is represented at this conference. It's a first for me, but I think it's telling. And I was curious to know if some of these Customs and Trade declaration, filing touch points, and disruptors are contributing to your upstream management of your items. So in other words, are these disruptors such as Customs, FDA, EPA, DOT, these disruptors, potentially when you file declaration, are those disruptive trends contributing to your decision-making process upstream? Thank you.
Me?
We'll start with Kerry. We'll start upstream.
I guess, so I have responsibility for customs and trade in my role. I think as you make decisions, you have to take into account all of the factors, and obviously the ever-changing trade dynamics are certainly things that have to be taken into account, whether it be tariffs on incoming goods, how you're going to manage the reporting requirements, et cetera. It's all part of the picture. I mean, we went through jumped through a bunch of hoops related to Brexit, and at the end of the day, it was just a big paperwork exercise in our view, nothing really tangible, but caused a lot of work. So I guess I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but certainly all of the customs and duties requirements have to be taken into account when you make decisions about where to buy your goods. So
Sure. No,
hopefully I
thank you.
answered.
Yeah, the FTA
Yeah.
comment was
Okay.
telling too. Thank you.
I think automotive has always taken FTAs into account. I think that when you look at the footprints for where automotive suppliers are, it's affordable labor, it's FTAs, it's taking advantage of good transit lanes, and I don't think that changes. With automotive, especially here in North America, the extent that you have to go through for calculations for NAFTA, now USMCA, and factoring in all the different complexities with forced labor screening and ensuring that you're really doing your due diligence to be a U.S.
Sure.
importer, I just don't think that's changed. It's
either.
always been hard, and it will remain to be difficult.
It was interesting to note what Jacob Ward mentioned, the sort of policy indication of friendshoring as well. I mean, I'm not going to ask the panel to comment on that, but it's just some obviously direction of where the government wants to see trade. We know there's some geopolitical shifts clearly happening in the world as well. Those will have to be factored into all of these decisions. Maybe time for one more audience question, and we have a hand right up there in the middle. It's right behind you, Ingo. Sorry, I missed it from there. Oh, I have two more, and then... But that's it, then. I think it'll come on. Can we...
Hello, good morning. As Kelly mentioned, logistics is not forte of tier one suppliers, but at the same time, the cost and the risk is basically, again, passed on to OEMs. My question to Edgar, is there any initiatives in vertical integrating the tier twos to tier one to the OEM, at least the bigger ones, so that you can control and you have visibility the full network? I think EV is automatically, the things are happening, vertical integration, but the other side, are there any initiatives on the other side as well?
So questions on integrating and visibility upstream, tier two, tier three, and tier one.
Yeah, that's one thing that we have been investing in, to tell you the truth. I think that we start that, and we call that resilience, and that's exactly what we are putting together. We started that. We are walking on that, and our idea is to have that visibility and integration for all the tiers. So that's one thing that we have been working cross-functionally internally, and we have a group that is completely dedicated to that. We started beginning of this year, and we call that resiliency. And the idea is for us to have all the tiers integrated. So then we're going to have not only visibility with a first tier, but also with the tiers.
Excellent. So we had one more audience question, which we'll go to now.
Jeffrey Luff from Siemens. So Kelly, you mentioned supply chain sustainability. And I find that we're using sustainability in two terms. Sustainability from resilience perspective and sustainability from the environment. So with all of the changes that we're going through, putting parts on the water and then having to fly them in, how are you guys balancing out the environmental sustainability issues?
I guess I will start by saying the sustainability initiatives IAC has, it's a journey first, right? So obviously when you're flying parts, you're not being very sustainable. But we have corporate objectives that we're working towards. I would say we are definitely more robust in how we're analyzing and trying to manage and impact sustainability and energy use within our four walls. That's really honest. I'll be perfectly transparent, where we've been able to get our arms around it at this point in time. I would say, the first guest spoke a lot about, sustainability and supply chain, et cetera, and transportation. We are really at the mercy of what happens from a technology standpoint on trucking. I mean, 85% of our logistics is done through trucks. So if we don't have, long-haul trucking options that are sustainable, we really aren't able to move the needle significantly. Obviously, planes are another one. We want to avoid putting things on planes at all costs anyway, and boats. So, we will definitely, work to embrace those options when they're available, when they are robust enough to give us the comfort that they are reliable, and we'll start, in working with our partners basically to investigate those options. But certainly flying parts around isn't sustainable, so we get that. So we try to minimize that for not only sustainability, but cost reasons as well. So, but yeah, I mean, it's a journey for sure. So are we there yet? No. Are we making progress? Yes. And I think we've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years just on measuring where we are and then putting goals in place to improve.
Yeah, you think you're at the mercy of things. As an asset-light logistics company, we are at the mercy of when our customers want to fly things. At DSV, we have science-based targets, and 96% of our greenhouse gas emissions are in scope 3. They are not really within our control, but step 1 is being able to calculate what your carbon footprint is as a baseline. Step 2 is looking at some goals and seeing if there's something we can do to help you optimize your supply chain design. Step 3 is insetting with SAF credits, especially for air. Like I mentioned, 96% of DSV's carbon footprint is in scope 3, and of that, more than half of that is air. So SAF credits are definitely a great way to inset, and I look forward to future technologies just like you, where we can all reduce our carbon footprint.
Absolutely. So I know we're running at the end here, so I'm just going to do a final question with short answers from each, because I think Ava mentioned coffee before, and I'm sure that's all anyone can think about now. And I promise you, we stuck to the Colombian supply chain, so it's there. But a final point, starting with you, James, strategic priority over the next 6 to 12 months to improve the resiliency of the automotive logistics supply chain. What's your parting thought on that front before we close?
So that's what I alluded to earlier. The strategic priorities will be adding more comprehensive visibility tools that overlay throughout the entire supply chain. The further you can go down your tiers, all the way to the final end user would be, the best across all the modes of transportation, so that we can have real-time visibility, which then gives us the opportunity to plan accordingly, right? So that we're not in a reactionary mode, so that we can predict disruptions as early as possible. And by predicting those disruptions as early as possible, it allows us to mitigate premium or avoid it altogether. And those, to me, are the most important at the moment.
Thank you, James. Eva?
Let's stop thinking transactionally. Let's think strategically. It's so important to figure out what your goals are. Conditions are changing, whether it's the latest typhoon or Sharknado, I'm sure is going to be next. So let's go back to basics. What are your goals? And let's find a way to achieve that in a long-term, sustainable, resilient way.
Thank you. Kelly?
I would say ditto. And in addition to that, I think really ensuring that we have the right teams in place to take us to the next level. I think the skill sets are changing, as I mentioned earlier, in supply chain. Supply chain is evolving to a real cornerstone of any manufacturing organization, and really we have a seat at the table, so let's not lose a seat at the table just because we don't want to be there just because it's a crisis mode. We want to be there because we're a strategic business partner. So do we have the right talent in place to sustain that seat at the table?
Excellent. Edgar, parting thoughts?
And I think I'm going to echo Eva in terms of being more strategic in terms of the way that we redesign our networks to optimize not only the flow of materials and vehicles, but also to optimize the cost. But I think on the short term, we're going to continue looking for where are our vehicles and where are our parts, and that's the visibility. And I think on top of that, I think that we're going to continue work on data analytics. I think that's one thing that we should continue pursuing that for sure.
Excellent. So fantastic priorities there. By next year, it's going to be all sorted, so we'll be able to move on from there. But I really want to thank everyone on the panel for sharing your open insights here.